Okay, we'll kick off with a competition statement. So the purpose of this is the working group call is to serve as a forum for discussion of regulatory, legal, policy, risk and infrastructure issues that will ultimately make the derivatives market safer and more efficient. All market participants are encouraged to take part. The focus of this call will be on the 2021 ISDA interest rate definitions. The call will comply strictly with the agenda. All participants are reminded that they act independently in the market, and each participant will ultimately make its own independent determination with respect to its own business operations. All participants are reminded not to exchange competitive information or convey business strategies. Council will interrupt and or stop this call if issues come up that should not be discussed. Through participation in the working group, participants agree not to use this process to accomplish any anti-competitive goal or use information obtained during the meeting for any anti-competitive purpose. We sent around an agenda earlier today which said that the purpose of this call would be to focus on the floating rate option matrix in particular, and as a kind of framework for that, a naming convention that ISDA, Linklaters and the FPML steering group have been discussing in relation to those floating rate options. So please consult your emails. There you'll see some materials that we circulated there that you'll be able to refer to. For people who have been taking part in our cash settlement provision feedback process, we also sent round the results of that process by a separate email. We don't intend to discuss it here because we've got quite a lot to cover, but please take a look at that. Linklaters are working on drafting, which we will circulate, and encourage you to feedback on if that hasn't already been circulated. So with that, Susanna, perhaps I could hand over to you. Is that okay?
Thanks, Rick. Hi, everybody. Now, we sent round a link through a different platform today through WebEx so that I could share the floating rate matrix on screen. Because what I intend to do is to take everyone through the floating rate matrix so you can see how the floating rate options are going to be represented in this format. If you have joined via the WebEx platform, you will be seeing that on your screen in front of you. If you have only dialed in by phone, then please go back to your email, find the attachment that is to send, and open that up. It's the one called the floating rate matrix, as I'm going to walk through that on the call. Okay, so today is going to be a little bit like a teach-in. It's going to be me bringing you all on board with what we have been doing on the floating rate matrix since this working group last was discussing the floating rate work stream. And so what I'm going to do is explain blow by blow how a floating rate option for each type of floating rate option is going to be represented. So what we have in the floating rate matrix is a mock-up of a handful of floating rate options. And what we've done is we've selected a floating rate option of different types. So because depending on the type of floating rate option, they're going to be represented slightly differently. Now in the covering email, what we set out there was a description of how floating rate options are now going to be set out into categories, and then within those categories, types. So there are three main categories of floating rate options. You can think of these as being level one, and every floating rate option will be one of these. It will be either a screen rate, or it will be a calculated rate, or be a reference bank rate. And reference bank rate now sweeps up anything that was called a reference dealer rate before. So we're not going to have a split concept of reference banks and reference dealers. Everything is just reference banks now. Okay, so I was saying within the category screen rate, you're going to have different types. So those types are set out in that email. So you've got term rates, swap rates, overnight rates.
Of course, term rates, overnight rates, swap rates, as you mentioned, published average rates, and a catch-all of other, which will capture various floating rate options that are screen rates, but which don't fit into any of the above categories.
Great, thank you. So, sticking with screen rates for now, before we go on to the next category, the first floating rate option, which you see here, is one which falls into the category screen rate and has the type term rate. So we've taken a basic term rate, AED EURIBOR, and this used to be called AED EURIBOR Reuters, but now this has been renamed based on the draft naming conventions proposal, where we're not including the source of rates in the name. In fact, we're not including the source anywhere in the floating rate option. So screen rate links into an operative provision, which is set out in the main book. And we also sent round section 6, which sets out the operative provisions. And you will need to read these just to understand how the information that's set out in this matrix is then linked back together to create the floating rate option. But I'll read out the relevant provision for you. When you have a floating rate option identified as a screen rate, the rate for the reset date will be the level of the benchmark in the column in the floating rate matrix entitled Underlying Benchmark. 4, if designated maturity is specified as applicable in the floating rate matrix, a period of the designated maturity provided by the administrator and published as of the fixing time on the fixing day. So this will be the case for any rate that is a screen rate. It is the rate for the underlying benchmark. And in column 3 there, you have the underlying benchmark, which is EURIBOR. If designated maturity is applicable, then it's the rate for the designated maturity. This is a term rate, so designated maturity is applicable, which means firms then populate designated maturity in their confirmation exactly as you do under the 2006 definitions. It is the rate published at the fixing time on the fixing day. So this tells you the fixing time, 1100 hours Abu Dhabi time. The fixing times are in 24-hour clock. And the fixing day, 2 Abu Dhabi business days preceding the reset date. And that provision tells you that it's a rate published by the administrator, and the administrator is set out here, in this case, the Central Bank of the UAE. Some additional information is also included as to what the floating rate day count fraction is. So previously we had in section 6 of the 2006 definitions certain day count fractions, not for every single floating rate option, but for just certain of them. Now what we're going to do is put the floating rate day count fraction in for every single floating rate option that is in the matrix. So that's been populated here. Now, the final four columns there relate to fallbacks. And so I'm not going to talk on those for now. We're going to have another call, hopefully next week on Tuesday, where we will send around another section of the book, which has the fallback provisions in, and we will talk through how fallbacks are going to work. But for the purpose of this call, I just want to focus on the other columns, which look at how we piece together the floating rate option. So that's a relatively simple one, where something is a screen rate and a term rate. Now let's go on to GBP LIBOR below. Now this is also a screen rate and a term rate, and it therefore follows exactly the same format as AED EURIBOR. The reason that this has been included in the matrix as an example is because GBP LIBOR, as you know, has it as a set of bespoke fallbacks, which have been published in the IBOR fallback supplement. And so that has some different provisions in the last 4 columns, but I'm not going to talk to those today. We'll go through fallbacks on Tuesday. So this has been populated in exactly the same way as AED EURIBOR. You get the underlying benchmark, whether designated maturity is applicable, fixing time, fixing day, and the administrator. Now, a question on the correction cutoff time. So we have this column here called correction cutoff time. And one point which we would like your feedback on is whether we need to put individual cutoff times in the matrix here. So, for example, SONIA publishes at 9 a.m., but it has a cutoff time for being republished for corrections of midday. We can either put that in the matrix so that firms know exactly what the cutoff time is, or we can go with a standard provision, which is currently drafted in section 6.15.2, which says that the cutoff time is the longer of 1 hour and the time provided by the administrator. So you would get to exactly the same place in that example that I've used for SONIA you would get to a cutoff time of midday, whether you were using that default position or setting it out in the matrix. So that's really just a question as to whether it would be helpful to put that information in here, or whether firms think that's unnecessary and we should be relying on the default position. Now, moving on to GBP SONIA. So again, sticking with the category screen rate, this is the type called overnight rate. So SONIA is obviously an overnight rate. Designated maturity is not applicable. So that tells you that you don't need to populate designated maturity in the confirmation. That's fairly obvious for an overnight rate like SONIA. It might be less obvious for some of the other rates which don't use designated maturity. So that column is populated with not applicable for designated maturity. We have the fixing time, 9 a.m. London time, and the fixing day, which, because SONIA publishes T+1, is the London business day following the reset date. And then in the column administrator, we have the administrator, the Bank of England, and the floating rate day count fraction has been populated. Now, coming back to this column here, applicable business day. Now, this did not appear in the term rates because you don't need it. Now, the reason this column is here is because when we introduce new compounding provisions, which we will do in the 2021 definitions, and actually is also already being worked on in the context of a supplement for 2006 definitions, those compounding provisions will no longer be embedded in the floating rate options as they are for GBP SONIA compound, USD SOFR compound, etc. They will be standalone, and they will be applied, they'll be switched on in the confirmation, and they will be applied in tandem with an overnight floating rate option. And this then tells you what are the days on which you're compounding the rate. So what are the days on which you're viewing the rate and compounding the rate in that compounding provision? That is the concept of applicable business day. So if you were using GBP SONIA as a floating rate option on its own, which is entirely possible, and not compounding it, then this column is of absolutely no application. It doesn't do anything. But if you're using this floating rate option and applying one of the compounding methods, then this column becomes important, and that is what it's there for. So that's an overnight rate. So all the overnight rates should follow that format. Now, GBP SONIA compound. Now, I just said that in the 2021 definitions, the compounding wouldn't be set out in the floating rate options. That is going to be true other than for the existing OIS floating rate options. So new compounding methods which are going to be introduced are look-back compounding, observation shift compounding, lockout compounding, and there will also be a standalone provision for OIS compounding, which is just compounding over the calculation period, OIS as you know it in the OIS floating rate options. But because there is already this, well-established OIS market, we're just going to keep the floating rate options for all the existing compounding floating rate options in the floating rate matrix. But the way in which they apply now is exactly the same as if you were using the modular approach of specifying an overnight floating rate option and specifying a compounding method. But instead of leaving it to the parties to do in the confirmation, it's being done here. So if parties specify GBP SONIA compound, then what you get is this column here, which tells you which compounding method to apply. So first off, we're now in the second category I mentioned of a calculated rate. And there is an operative provision in section 6.8.1, which tells you that when a floating rate option is identified as a calculated rate, then the rate for the reset date will be determined in accordance with the process described for the calculated rate type. So then you need to know, what is the calculated rate type? Well, this type of calculated rate is a compounded floating rate option, GBP SONIA compound. And a compounded floating rate option again, there's an operative provision which directs you to calculate the rate using the compounding method specified in the matrix. So in this case, we're using OIS compounding, and there will be a provision in the main book setting out OIS compounding. So underlying benchmark, this now follows the same format as what you've seen above for the term rates. So what's the underlying benchmark? It's SONIA. Designated maturity, it's not applicable. You don't need one. Fixing time and fixing date, this is the same as SONIA. And here you have again this concept of applicable business day, which will then get input into that OIS compounding provision and tell you on which days you are viewing the rate and compounding the rate over the calculation period. I'll finish my run through and then I will open up to questions on any of these. Now, staying with the second category, calculated rate. So calculated rate, we are contemplating 4 types of calculated rate. You have seen the first one here in GBP SONIA compound. That is a compounded floating rate option. And the second one is an average floating rate option. Now, at the moment, the only average floating rate option that exists is your Ionia average. And we have put this in brackets as an average floating rate option because it's actually not clear to us from this formula here if this is just a standard arithmetic average. So I have a question to everybody on the call who is familiar with this floating rate option and uses it. Please, can you tell us if this is just a standard arithmetic average of the rate over the relevant calculation period? The reason for asking the question is we're not sure what the numerator of 100 is doing in the formula here. Let's assume this is just a plain arithmetic average applied to Ionia. Then you need to set out the averaging method. So exactly as we did for the compounded floating rate option where we set out the compounding method, we set out the averaging method. And the averaging method, we think, will be straight averaging. So if your Ionia average is just using straight averaging, then the averaging method is straight averaging. And that will be an operative provision in the main book, and it will tell you how to calculate that floating rate option from the underlying benchmark. Now, if it's not an average floating rate option, if it uses something completely different, then it is a bespoke formula. So that is another type of calculated rate. And when it's a bespoke formula, then the bespoke formula will be set out somewhere. Now, at the moment, we don't have any bespoke formula floating rate options, unless your Ionia average is actually a bespoke formula floating rate option. But even if this is not a bespoke formula, if it's just a standard averaging formula, then it's useful to have this concept of bespoke formula in there for any other floating rate options which get introduced at a later date, which don't use either one of the standing compounding formulas or don't use one of the averaging formulas which to introduce. And then if it's a bespoke formula, we could either set out the formula here in the floating rate option like this, or it could be set out somewhere in the main book. So that's another open question as to where we set that information out. It's more user-friendly to have it in one place, but it makes the floating rate matrix that bit less streamlined as well to have that type of operative provision in the matrix. But as I say, at the moment, that's only potentially applicable to your Ionia average. So a note on the averaging methods, because you're probably wondering what they are. They are not included yet because that work is being done first on the 2006 definitions, but there's going to be 4 averaging methods. So they're all going to be using an arithmetic average, and you'll get one which is straight averaging, and that is just averaging over the calculation period. You'll get one which is look back averaging, and so it's averaging the look back of 5 days of, well, whatever the number of specified days look back is, one which will be an observation period shift averaging, and one which will be a lockout averaging. So they're mirroring what's happening on the compounding provisions as well. So that work's been done on the 2006 definitions first, and when that's completed, then it will will be populated in the 2021 definitions as well. Right, so these columns for your area average start to look very familiar. You have your underlying benchmark, designated maturity, not applicable because it's an overnight rate, fixing time and fixing day. Now, for this one, this looks a little bit different because it's telling you that your fixing day is by reference to day I, where day I is set out will be set out in the formula for calculating averaging. If you think about the existing OIS formula, you know that has a definition of I in it, which relates to every business day on which the rate is published. And that concept of I is used here whenever we have a formula which uses I, then that taps into the fixing day, and that determines the fixing day. Applicable business days, again, because this is part of the methodology for calculating the average. You need to know what days you're viewing the rate and what days you're averaging. And that's the concept of applicable business days. For this rate, it is target settlement days. And again, you've got the administrator and the floating rate day count fraction. Before we move on from calculated rate, sticking with calculated rate, just to recap, there'll be 4 different types of calculated rate. We've only got 2 in the matrix. We've got a compounded floating rate option and an average floating rate option. The other 2 are index and bespoke formula. The bespoke formula I've spoken about, and index, what this will be is when you are going to use a published index, and you need to apply an index formula to be able to determine what your rate is. So, for example, if you want to use SONIA compounded index, which is being published, that rate on its own doesn't help you tell you what the floating rate is for your calculation period. You need to know the rate for the beginning of the calculation period, the rate for the end of the calculation period, put them into your index formula, and that will be the rate. So you can see that is also a type of calculated rate. Now, we don't have any examples of those at the moment because the floating rate options for them have not yet been drafted. But once they've been drafted, and that work will be done on the 2006 definitions first, then we'll put an example of that into this matrix for you to see what, in terms of approach, the approach is going to be exactly the same as what you've seen for the compounded floating rate options and the average floating rate options. Back to screen rate here, and we have mocked up something here which is a swap rate. Now, when something is a swap rate, the underlying benchmark is a little bit harder to describe because it's the underlying benchmark is itself the swap rate, and it will be the swap rate for swaps where the floating leg is another benchmark, and normally that is all set out in the floating rate option. And so that will be populated in here. Now, some floating rate options don't tell you what the benchmark for the floating leg of the swap is. It will just say it's the quarterly swap rate for Australian dollar swap transactions, for example. Now, that was the case with this floating rate option. But what we need to do is we need to distinguish one currency swap rate on one underlying benchmark from a swap rate on another underlying benchmark. So an obvious example of this is now we have swap rates for LIBOR swaps and swap rate for SONIA swaps. So if we just describe them as swap rate for GBP swap transactions, that's not helpful because they would both be described exactly the same. So in this underlying benchmark for swap rates now, there always needs to be included a description of what the floating leg of that swap is. And that will possibly make its way into the name of the floating rate option as well. That hasn't been done at the moment because the naming convention has still been moving, but we've sent you around a draft of the naming convention, and that naming convention explains how, when you've got a swap rate, you should include the name of what the benchmark for the floating leg of the swap is to distinguish it from another swap rate. with a different benchmark as the floating leg, but for the same currency. So that, for example, we will have GBP LIBOR swap rate, and we'll have GBP SONIA swap rate. So LIBOR as the floating leg of the swap is included in the name of the floating rate option. So that's a change from what was done in the 2006 definition as well. And there'll be a bit of work for us to do on those because, as I say, not all the floating rate options tell us what the benchmark for the floating leg is. So we may need working group input on that when we come to populate the matrix for all of those swap rates. Now, swap rates, like term rates, have designated maturities. So designated maturity is applicable and then gets populated as normal in the confirmation. It has a fixing time and a fixing day, and equally any swap rate has an administrator. Now, some of the swap rates, it's not obvious to us what the administrator is, so we will need working group input on that. And every time we send out an updated draft of the matrix, there will be work to do. We will need you all to be looking at this and telling us whether we've got the administrator right or not, because the administrator is not mentioned in the existing floating rate options and not always obvious from the description of that floating rate option. Now, the final one that we have mocked up here is a reference bank rate floating rate option. Now, there are lots of these floating rate options. Some of them can be used on a standalone basis, as in they could be referenced directly in the confirmation as the relevant floating rate option, but mainly they apply as fallbacks, and they are still then therefore going to be included so that they can apply as a temporary non-publication fallback where it's appropriate to use that as a temporary non-publication fallback. And that's particularly going to be the case for swap rates, where if there's a non-publication for a swap rate, it would be appropriate to go out to the relevant dealers to get quotes for that swap rate and determine the rate just for that day on which there wasn't a publication using those dealer quotations. Now, this table here looks quite a bit different from the others, naturally, because reference bank rates are just a bit different. And we initially did wonder whether they lent themselves to being represented in a matrix format at all. But we think it is better to keep anything that is a floating rate option in one place in the matrix. So it has been represented in matrix format, even though you still end up with quite a lot of text in the matrix to describe what is being requested. So this is the third and final category, reference bank rate. And at the moment, we haven't given these any type because we're not sure if this needs to be included or not. Certainly, they don't need a type to be part of the operative provision. So if we included a type here, it would be purely just as a tag or some sort of indicator to users as to what type of rate that is. So have a think about whether you think that would be useful to include a type. For example, for this one, the type could be swap rate, which is what it is. It's a reference bank rate for a swap rate. Or alternatively, given that it's going to be entirely non-operative, as I've explained, we might just not include a type at all, and it would simply be a reference bank rate. Now, reference bank rates can have a designated maturity. Not all of them will have, but in this case it does, because the swap rate for which quotations are being requested itself has a designated maturity. So that's the swap rate above here, quarterly swap rate ICAP. So designated maturity is applicable. They mainly all have fixing times and fixing days, so that gets populated. And then you get this quite long description here of what's being asked as the required quotations. And that will just follow what's in the existing floating rate option. Now, reference banks, if you remember, there was a definition of reference banks in the 2006 definition, which was a long list of reference banks for many of the floating rate options, but not all of them, in fact. And So this follows a similar approach of just listing out what the reference banks are, but instead of having that long definition, it will be here right next to the floating rate option in the matrix. So it's much easier to find than it was previously. I mentioned at the beginning that we're merging the concept of reference banks and reference dealers. So this will be called reference banks even when it's in fact dealers. As you can see here, these reference banks are the leading swap dealers in the Australian interbank bank market. So don't necessarily have to be banks as we think of them as banks. And as a third category, there is an operative provision again in section 6.8.1, which tells you how to determine the rate for your calculation period using this information for a reference bank rate in the matrix. And it tells you that if a rate is identified as a reference bank rate, then the rate for the reset date will be the arithmetic mean after eliminating the highest quotation, or in the event of equality, one of the highest, and the lowest quotation, or in the event of equality, one of the lowest of the required quotations. So it's effectively the arithmetic mean of the required quotations, which is this here in the column required quotations. So those operative provisions which I have been talking about are in 6.8 of the rider which we sent round. That's an extract of section 6. So 6.8 is called determinations using the floating rate matrix. So have a read of that. It's not that long. It sets out those operative provisions which I've read out on this call, and explains to you how to use this matrix to determine the rate. I mean, once you've read it and had a look at it once or twice, I think it will become fairly obvious. So while this matrix, it may look intimidating because it's very different from how the floating rate options are set out in the 2006 definitions. If you look at it just once for one category and then look at the operative provision, it will become very clear how to use it, and I think will be very easy to use. So what we are looking for now is feedback on this mock-up that we sent out, answers to all the questions that we have put in here. So we've got notes in here highlighted in yellow. If you're looking at it this week, please just ignore the last 4 columns: applicable fallback rate and temporary non-publication triggers and fallbacks, and permanent cessation triggers and fallbacks, and administrator benchmark triggers and fallbacks. Because what we are going to do is send you round the section which has all the fallback provisions in, and run through those on another call, because we thought it would be a bit too much to digest all on this one call. So that's on the matrix. Mark, if you could unmute all the lines, then I will open it up to questions. Does anybody have any questions on any of this?
Susanna, just one question on that last one with the reference banks we just looked at. In the name, it had ICAP in there. Was that deliberate? Because I thought we're saying this would be the generic fallback, or this could be a generic fallback in the event of temporary non-publication. This one here, yeah. That's right. I've got this note to the working group. Thanks for pointing that out. I hadn't drawn your attention to that. So at the moment, this is a reference bank rate which is specific to this swap rate published by ICAP. So that reference bank rate is only going to be used either if it's referenced directly as the floating rate option, which is very unlikely, or it's going to be used as the fallback to this swap rate. Now, we didn't discuss fallbacks, but if you look, you can see how this works here. If you go to the column headed temporary non-publication trigger, temporary non-publication fallback, and you look at the temporary non-publication fallback, we have proposed AUD swap rate ICAP reference banks as the temporary non-publication fallback. We did have a thought as to whether, instead of including all of the reference bank floating rate options like this, we try to draft one which is completely generic. So a generic definition of going out to the reference banks to get quotations for whatever your relevant floating rate option is in the event of a temporary non-publication.
we haven't gone that route. And actually, at this point, we don't know whether that's really feasible because of the way the required quotations for all of these reference bank rates are slightly different from one to the other. Well, they're in fact entirely bespoke on a rate per rate basis. But if you think there is merit in doing that, in getting rid of all of the reference bank floating rate options and having a generic provision which provides a temporary non-publication fallback of going to reference banks, and then simply applying that. So imagine we just had a temporary non-publication fallback called reference banks. Here it would say reference banks, and then that would be applied. Then we can look at doing that. So for the moment, this is respecting the status quo of the 2006 definitions by having all of the bespoke reference bank floating rate options included individually. But we'd appreciate your thoughts on that, on whether it would just be cleaner to have one generic reference bank fallback that applied as a temporary non-publication fallback to certain floating rate options.
Susanna, just one question. There was a request for input on the various conventions for the 2006 definitions as they applied to risk-free rates, which I assume are the same conventions that we're talking about here for purposes of the new 2021 definitions. But the idea is that these conventions will apply across the board to floating rate options as opposed to just risk-free rates. Is that correct? And to the extent that there were different provisions regarding compounding, averaging, and the like in the earlier definitions, that these new conventions are going to replace those across the board. Is that right?
So the new conventions are not going to replace what's there already, because the new conventions, they all assume you're using an overnight rate. So while that means they're probably predominantly going to be used for the new risk-free rates, they can be used with any overnight rates that are included in the 2006 definition. So for example, Fed funds, that's an overnight rate. You can use that. You can use the Fed funds floating rate option with the new compounding provisions. The reason we're not replacing the existing compounding provisions is because, one, they allow you to compound any floating rate option, not just an overnight rate, whereas the new compounding provisions are all built off the back of OIS compounding, which is compounding an overnight rate. So that's one reason we're not replacing them. So the existing compounding provisions will still be there, and you can create compounding periods within a calculation period. So if you have a calculation period of 3 months, you could create a compounding period every month and compound 3 times within your calculation period using the existing compounding provisions. And then the second reason why we're not replacing them is because there are 3 different types of compounding. There's straight compounding, spread exclusive compounding, and flat compounding, and they are all used. So we're not trying to replace those, whereas the new compounding provisions for use with the overnight rates, they are all effectively spread exclusive compounding. So they're not creating the ability to do flat compounding or compounding with the spread added on for the overnight rates, because there's no need for that.
If you have compounding that's applicable to a transaction at the moment, and say you have 2 compounding periods in the calculation period, then you would still use the original compounding provisions that are in the 2006 definitions that will be carried over to the 2021. So these new sort of modular approach, where you have the which are very, as Susanna said, which are basically variations of the OAS compounding. And the reason why we proposed a modular approach to that is so that you can make different variations of that. You could apply a look back, you can apply an offset lag, you can adjust the number of days of those lags and those offsets. So rather than actually creating a different floating rate option for every one of those variations, which would mean a very large booklet, we're allowing people to sort of piece them together and create their own variation of that OAS compounding methodology with the overnight rate. But as Susanna said, we're keeping the self-compounding FROs, which are used for the OAS markets at the moment, and which are used for clearing, because we don't want to sort of disrupt the current operation of the market that are using those self-compounding FROs, where everything is just built into the FRO. So you only have to specify the FRO name, and it does everything. Everything's contained within that floating rate option definition. But if we were to do that for all the different variations, we would have a huge number of variations. So the modular approach is just a way to make that more efficient.
Yeah, I get the last point, Jonathan, but I was just trying to go back to, I think, what Susanna was saying, that for things like, let's say, Prime or something like that, which has a daily reset, that you would still use the existing conventions. I mean, if you wanted to, I guess, you could use the new conventions. These are really going to be additive conventions, really, as it relates to the risk-free rates, that because of what's happened in terms of developing these rates.
Yeah, that's right. That's
basically it. Yeah.
Okay.
But as you said, you will have a choice now. So if you want to use the old provisions for the prime rate, you can do that. If you want to use the new provisions for the prime rate, you can do that too. So now for overnight rates, you have options.
And if one convention develops for, say, an offset lag that everybody starts to use, and one variation becomes the dominant one, and that's used for sort of 95% of trades, then maybe it would make sense eventually to add that in as a self-compounding floating rate option. But I think while there are lots of different variations and lots of different people doing it different ways to match what's in the cash market, then that modular approach makes sense, which will flow into this matrix.
Yeah, I think it's going to complicate things for the cash market right now, because to the extent you've got these offering circulars that have a menu of rates, you can't just use a standard compounding definition to the extent that you're using, for example, a risk-free rate versus another rate like. So that's something that people are going to have to keep in mind, I guess, with respect to the cash products. I get the modularity here, and it's one you can do what you need to do under your derivative, but it is going to impact how people disclose how their rates are being calculated under the cash products.
I think here we're just giving people the option, the variety, so people can create whatever variation they want in an efficient way with the modular approach. But if a single convention emerges in the cash markets that everyone uses, then as I say, it might make sense to actually create that into a self-compounding FRO eventually, so that you don't have to select. Make the different elections. You can just select the relevant floating rate option name. But I think that's the point, down the track when we see what, if a single convention develops.
But Jonathan, I mean, I think there's a middle ground approach which potentially could be considered, which is you actually code in as a default the look back period or something within the definition for the floating rate option. So I think what you're saying is you could create a dedicated floating rate option. I mean, my fear, my fear with these new compounding methods, like the compounding with look back, etc., as drafted in the 2006 memorandum, is that doesn't easily support the electronic confirmation or an electronic flow, which is going to be a problem for developing liquidity. So whilst it's good to have all that flexibility in the language, if in fact 90% of them really want to use a 5-day look back, it doesn't offer an ability just to say, I'm being silent on the look back period, and I'm just going to say I want compounding with look back, and all the other things are sort of hardwired in through a default, through default elections. So I think that so I think there may be a middle ground, because I don't see how it's going to coalesce other than everything having to go to paper confirmations for all those different permutations.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can talk about we'll talk about that conventions on a follow-up call when we collated the feedback that we've had on that proposal. But I think the proposal at the moment is currently fairly a middle ground, because there was a complete modular approach that was on the table, and we've kind of embedded the different approaches to sort of look backs, offset shift, observation shift, lock out, etc., into the actual OAS formula. So we have sort of there has been a sort of middle ground with that. So all you need to then piece together is, what the overnight rate is and how many days you want to apply the look back. But, I think we're collating the feedback on that, and, we will do a follow-up call on that specific point. And that will, go into the 2006 definitions as soon as that is developed, and, flow into the 2021 definitions, and, into the matrix, But the point about the matrix that Susanna was mentioning is that you just need to have the actual FROs, with the applicable business state to make that work for the matrix. So we will talk about that, on a separate call once we've collated all the feedback. So maybe now we go back to questions on the actual matrix.
If there's no more questions on the matrix, then also just to remind firms that we've sent out a draft of the list of FROs. That's all the FROs that we're proposing to put into this matrix. So all of them that will be in the 2021 definitions. Now, that was compiled by asking firms to send us the lists of the FROs that they used, tell us which ones they didn't use, which ones have been discontinued, etc. And so from that, we have put together this list. We have added into it the new floating rate options that we know are in the pipeline. But obviously, we need you to tell us if there's anything missing. So can you make sure that goes to the right departments in your institution for them to have a look at it and make sure we've got everything on there? We don't want to miss out some floating rate options that firms are using just because they didn't make their way back to us, so they never made their way in.
You would have seen the attachment on the naming conventions for the FROs that Susanna mentioned, because obviously currently in the 2006 definitions, it's a little bit random, what FROs are called, which kind of causes obviously problems for identifying the rate for systems, depending if there are some sort of unusual characters that have been added into that FRO name. So big thanks to the FPML working group who have done the work on that and have produced that proposal for the naming conventions. I think it's a very good simple proposal that hopefully will bring standardization to the floating rate option name, and allow people to when a new rate comes along, allow people to actually predict what that floating rate option name will be before we've gone through the whole process of agreeing the different elements of that floating rate option. So I think that's a big step forward. So people could read through that and come back with feedback on that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. So with 3 minutes to go then, just again, another plea to please look at this. This will be open for feedback for the next couple of weeks, because then what we would like to do is move forward with populating this. Obviously, we've got about 200 floating rate options that need to go in this format. We won't do it all at once, so it will be an iterative process. But what we want to do is lock down the format for the types, the categories and the types that we have got in this mock-up. So have a look at this. We want to lock this down, and then we will move forward with populating the matrix, and then it will will be recirculated frequently for firms to have a look at the way we're introducing the floating rate options. So over the next couple of weeks, have a look at it and let us know your thoughts.